1. A pulse-pounding dark techno beat drove the writhing, seething mass of bodies lit overhead by a kaleidoscope of color on the second floor of the duplex, one of the most popular dance clubs in Prague, which was saying something given that Czechs liked to party. Prague had more nightclubs and bars per person than London, New York, or Tokyo. Wednesday night or Saturday night made no difference. Dancing and drinking until 5 a.m. before stumbling into a rideshare or a taxi, alone or not, happened most nights for the city's singles. It was the perfect environment for losing track of yourself. It was also the perfect environment for assassins from Unit 29155 of the GRU, Russian military intelligence, to succeed in poisoning a target. All while enjoying a few beers and groping plenty of drunk, half-dressed women. It was their signature method for deniability, while sending a message at the same time. We can get to you anytime, anywhere. Not tonight, if she had anything to do with it. Alzbeta Cherna, a captain in the Vojenské Spravodajství, the Czech military intelligence known as the VZ, had spent the last 3 years stalking the members of Unit 29155. Beta wasn't going to let her quarry escape now. Keen anticipation sharpened her senses and tightened her abdominal muscles. She resisted the almost overwhelming urge to slip her karambit, the wicked little hooked knife in her thigh boot, into her hand. Instead, she flexed her fingers, imagining sending her internal heat into the turgid air. It might have been her imagination, but the temperature in the club seemed to climb around her. A smoky tang burned her nostrils and clung to her skin, mixing with the rich, sweet scent of her perfume. The hard-driving industrial bass line kept time with the beating of her heart and the rhythm of her stride. The erratic flashing lights illuminated the staircase to the top level. There, the Russians sat on 2 white velvet sectionals that let them watch the dance floor below. Beta didn't need the lights to see. Her dragon vision recognized their infrared signatures. Even if that failed, and it wouldn't, she smelled them. "I've never been broken," repeated an electronic female voice as she moved through the crowd. It could have been her anthem. Dancers pulled away from her, repelled by a dark, invisible force, before closing in behind her and erasing her wake. Most moved instinctively, blindly, as worms move away from painful stimuli. Those few aware enough to glance toward her saw an avenging angel, dressed in black, and stumbled, icy terror sobering them. 1 or 2 drifted in her direction, attracted to the danger emanating from her in refracted light waves like a shadowy mirage over desert sands. She ignored them. When she reached the top of the stairs, she turned left toward the bar. She felt the gaze from the Russian in the far sectional facing her. Even though she was more than 6 meters from him and surrounded by sweaty clubgoers who reeked of cologne, cigarette smoke, and alcohol, she scented the spike in the assassin's pheromones. She saw the matching spike of white heat in his groin. The smile that curled the corner of her mouth didn't reach her eyes. Zatim Dolid. So far, so good. The men and women around her shifted to let her approach the bar. They gave her plenty of room to prop her forearms on the glossy blonde wood. The bartender caught her gaze and hurried over. "Trey bitch," she said. When he turned, she clamped his wrist. 2 fingers, no ice. He nodded. "Understood." A minute later, he set the single malt Czech whiskey on the bar in front of her. The industrial bass line changed to dark synth with rhythmic piano chords interspersed with drum brushes on cymbal. The crowd on the dance floor slowed and swayed, many individuals clustering in 2s and 3s. She swallowed the whiskey. Its silk slid down her heated throat. Lifting her chin at the bartender, whose gaze had darted toward her while he worked farther along the bar, she slid the empty tumbler toward him. This was new, this awareness of her incredible power over the attention of others. She'd always hidden in the recesses, the shadows of her assignments. But ever since she'd gone undercover on this mission, Beta had found herself growing beyond her psychic boundaries. It wasn't confidence. It was something darker. something she'd kept chained, until she'd burned everything important to her to identify and gather evidence against the men who'd bombed Czech ammunitions depots and killed Czech citizens. The arrogant men who thought they were impervious to the laws of other nations, who acted with impunity. Beta looked in the mirror behind the bartender and watched the Russians and their guests. Only 2 of the infamous Unit 29155 had come to the Prague meet. That was wise. It wouldn't do for the entire 6-member team to be seen together, which made it that much trickier for her. The 2014 bombings near the border with Slovakia had been carried out by a team of 2. She'd spent the past 3 years building an extensive profile on the shadowy unit and tracking its missions. To complicate her task, Beta wasn't the only one hunting Unit 29155 assassins. The British also wanted the Russian operatives who'd poisoned former Russian military officer Sergei Skripal and his daughter in England only a couple of months ago. Beta had tracked 2 Unit 29155 assassins, traveling under the names Ruslan Bashirov and Alexander Petrov, to Salisbury where Skripal lived in exile. She hadn't realized what Bashirov and Petrov intended until it was too late. If, as her investigation suggested, Bashirov and Petrov had also bombed the Czech arms depots, the British would find themselves failing. What would the Russian officer staring at her think when he realized that the bit of eye candy that he slavered over turned out to be the bodyguard of the arms broker they were meeting? As with everything in this murky, shifting world of espionage and hidden motives, not everyone or everything was exactly as it seemed. The Russians would be wise to keep that fact in mind also. The bartender set another whiskey in front of her. She nodded and dropped a wad of cash on the bar. It didn't matter whether she kept drinking or not. Her metabolism burned alcohol as if it were fuel. She never got drunk, not even tipsy. But she didn't need to spend any more time or money on this feint. Let her admirer wrongly assume that she'd been impaired, even a little, by the whiskey. "It's all about humanity," repeated a deep male voice over the sound system as the dark techno beat picked up again. The throbbing mass below moved faster. A faint brush of energy, like static electricity before a thunderstorm, moved across her. She shifted her gaze to the reflection of the large male Viking now standing at her side. His shoulder-length white blonde hair accentuated his massive shoulders, which only led her gaze to take in his equally large biceps and chest. She was tall and afraid of no one, but his imposing height and mass made her feel vulnerable. Yet there was also something comforting about his presence. For a moment, she recalled another large male, equally massive at more than 2.5 meters and over 100 kilograms, more than twice her weight. A male with wavy brown hair and eyes the color of deep space. But nothing more came to her. A sharp ache pierced her between the eyes instead. She shook her head. No time to think about the gaping holes in her memory. The Viking's eyes focused on the mirror. Something shivered through her at their brilliant blue gleam. It was bone-deep recognition, and it terrified her. "What are you looking at, my friend?" she asked, letting an aggressive note sharpen her tone. He shrugged and turned away. Relief flooded her as though God's searchlight had moved on and left her in darkness once again. Sniffing, she rotated and leaned against the bar, propping herself on an elbow and staring back at the Russian officer. If she didn't know better, she'd wonder if being this close to her goal had jangled her nerves. At that thought, Beta blew the Russian a kiss. He laid his hand on his crotch and raised his tumbler in a toast. "Vool, idiot." She smiled, imagining using her karambit to slice through the waistband of his jeans. Would he be so confident then? "Marika." While she'd been engaging the Russian, a male wearing a blazer and slacks had shifted into the opening where the Viking had stood. That shocked her. Why hadn't she realized that the Viking had left? Scowling, Beta shoved the thought into a dark crevice at the back of her mind. She looked over her shoulder and gave a short nod to acknowledge her cover identity. "Gordon." Her voice sounded cool and detached. Good. She couldn't afford to let emotion distract her. Drew Gordon, her new employer, smiled as he signaled for a drink.
I see you've attracted the attention of our buyers.
He turned to address the bartender.
Chopin, neat and ice cold, if you please, and leave the bottle.
The bartender nodded and turned to pull the Polish vodka from a shelf behind him. Betta studied Gordon's profile as he waited. She'd heard his unfamiliar accent at their introductory meeting a week before. She thought it was American, perhaps something from the south of that enormous country, but it was new to her. As far as she could tell, however, Gordon was indeed the arms dealer that he purported to be. "You drink Polish vodka?" she asked, truly curious. Gordon had told her that he was meeting with members of the Ukrainian military, who opposed Russian-backed militia in their country. His vodka choice signaled ignorance about the buyer's true background and intentions. Or not. She'd be a fool to think anyone operating in the international world of arms sales took anything at face value. Gordon was no exception. It had taken months of careful planning and a rock-solid legend to get the interview with him, and a job offer only after she'd defeated the other candidates in hand-to-hand combat. Gordon smiled at her. It was mischievous.
"A little test, you see,"
he said. And then she knew that he suspected who the Russians were. No self-respecting Russian would choose to drink Polish vodka when Russian vodka was available. Betta nodded. Gordon tossed back his shot before grabbing the bottle of Chopin and pivoting toward the Russians.
"Come, let's introduce ourselves."
Betta fell into step at his side, her arm linked through his as though they were on a date. She let the fingers of her free hand skim the top of her boot. The karambit fairly hummed inside its hidden sheath. "Patience," she told the part of her that wanted to swoop in and snatch the Russian who'd stared at her before dragging him off to her lair. It was getting harder and harder to keep it chained. Gordon stopped in front of the Russians and a half-dozen other men and women seated with them. Betta scanned the low table between the sectionals. She glimpsed several plastic bags filled with pills among the bottles and glasses littering its surface. All of these, the people and the drugs, were props. The Russians were entirely sober, their glittering dark gazes sharpened on Gordon and Betta.
"A drink before we get to business?"
Gordon asked, waggling the bottle of Chopin. Tension thickened the smoky air as the Russians looked at the Polish vodka. For a moment, Betta wondered if the Russians would snarl and tell them to leave. Instead, the bearded Russian nodded. The slight curl of his lips never made it past sneer to a convincing smile, however. The other Russian, the one whose gaze devoured her, slid over and patted the seat next to him. Betta ignored the invitation. When Gordon had poured everyone a measure of vodka, he raised the bottle in toast.
"To new friends, then. May all our transactions be as smooth as this vodka."
The bearded Russian lifted his glass.
"Na zdorowia. Cheers."
In Ukrainian. Though his voice was friendly, his infrared signature blazed in anger. Betta smiled. And then the club exploded in chaos as thick smoke choked the air, and men in dark tactical gear erupted onto the dance floor, sending the dancers scattering like water drops on a hot pan. A little more than a kilometer northwest of the duplex, a 15-minute walk for ordinary humans, a horde of demonia materialized on the iconic Charles Bridge over the Vltava River at the same moment the strike squad breached the packed club. Elioud warrior Androsh Nog, who'd tracked this particular nasty group of spiritual marauders from Munich, ignored the nano-origami perched in his ear tweeting at him. He didn't need the distraction right now. Whatever the Zonia wanted to tell him could wait. He eased under the old town bridge tower, which guarded the entrance to the city's medieval heart on the east bank of the river. He'd already shunted his internal heat into his specially designed tactical clothing, effectively cloaking his infrared signature. Now he adjusted his harmonics to match the tower's 700-year-old stone. To all but the most perceptive angelic senses, his signatures would read as inanimate. The demonia, who'd siphoned enough harmonic energy to escape their underworld prison, were not the most perceptive spirits. Androsh grinned without humor. Though it was almost 2 a.m, old-fashioned carriage lights blazed along the 500-meter length of stone bridge in front of him. Except for the 30 statues of saints flanking both sides of the Gothic structure, it was deserted at this hour. In a city that never slept, the nightlife danced and drank in modern clubs and bars instead. Androsh inhaled, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't been in the capital of the Czech Republic for almost 3 years, not since he'd come on an Elioud mission to recover a stolen Caravaggio painting, The Infatuation of the Watcher Angels. A mission that failed, leaving him and his partner Alzbeta Cherna, a grey Elioud and friend of the Zonia, gravely wounded. Androsh had carried Beta to safety, never leaving her side as they were transported to his lord's estate to recover. And then, after depleting the angelic mana stored in the Caravaggio, Beta had taken his heart and disappeared without a trace. At that memory, Androsh clenched his jaw and forced the spurt of heat it elicited into his boots. Miro Kos, his Elioud teammate who designed the boots, had guaranteed they wouldn't melt. Instead, the graphene material converted the heat into energy stored in lithium batteries in the soles. Just as Androsh's tactical clothing collected his body heat and kinetic energy and transferred it into more lithium batteries sewn into the seams. The ingenious little batteries powered all of the electrical systems in his tactical gear. Exhaling heated breath, Androsh shrugged. Too bad he couldn't raise his temperature enough to melt the microscopic bullet fragments near his spine. The only physical reminder he had that Beta had ever been in his arms. His nano-origami chirped again. Androsh fine-tuned the nano-origami's harmonics to transmit audio. Perfectly matched to his own harmonics, the tuning of the microscopic bots prevented unauthorized sources from intercepting transmissions between him and the rest of the Elioud team. It was almost as secure as flashing, their preferred mode for communicating mentally, with a wider broadcast range. Not necessary around the ethereal demonia, but a definite plus in their increasing engagement with living agents of the dark angelic forces. Hence, the Elioud maintained comms discipline while on every mission.
Go for Giant.
A hint of smoke tickled his nose as Androsh spoke. He frowned. Giant, this is Harlequin. Stop ignoring me. The Zonia's voice spoke in his ear. Olivia Castrioti, his lord's wife, sounded irritated. We have a situation. Do you copy? Androsh locked onto the lead demon that had come into view next to the statue of St. Francis Borgia in the middle of the bridge. It appeared to be the restless soul of a dark Elioud, one who'd abjured his duty to fight on the side of the Angeli Fidelis, and died unredeemed. The souls of these humans with angel blood had a particularly tormented look on their countenances. The demon's gaze lifted toward the statues of 2 angels flanking St. Francis Borgia. It sneered. Androsh eased his foot forward. Androsh! The Zonia's authority crackled through the nano-origami. The molecular machines hummed as their harmonics responded, sending an electric jab into his flesh. He shook his head at the stinging sensation in his ear. Olivia was the only Elioud who'd mastered that particular technique, thankfully. The irony was that she accessed his lithium batteries to make it happen. A love tap, she called it. Olivia really loved him.
A situation. Copy that.
The lead demon halted, its alert gaze searching the bridge in front of it. The demonia streamed past, oblivious to their leader's hesitation. Androsh paused. This one was more sensitive than the average underworld dweller. Area 2 has picked up reports of a disturbance southeast of you, not far from Venceslas Square. Blackbird's close enough to sense significant harmonic discord. Androsh kept still as the unholy spirits floated on harmonic currents toward him like malicious spectral jellyfish. Spectral jellyfish who would inject psychic poison upon contact with unwary souls. Should the demonia manage to infest anyone, they would feed on the victim's harmonic energy. As the dark spirits fed on their victims, they would grow in power and agency. And so would madness, mayhem, and murder.
Convenient timing,
said Andrash. He shuddered as the demonia polluted the harmonic plane around him.
Steady, steady,
he told himself. His harmonics stayed anchored to the stone tower, but his voice had resonated through the demonia's dark chorus. As mindless as these beings were, they would still recognize the unmistakable sound of human speech. Fall back until we know more. The demonia could be a distraction. Before Andrash could confirm that order, the lead demon appeared right in front of him. Hollow eyes and a gaping maw filled his vision, and then the creature lunged, wrapping its icy hands around his throat. Mutters, shrieks, groans, and cries of an entire mob battered his ears. Discordant vibrations surged through his harmonics. For a sickening moment, Andrash feared that he'd be swamped. And then the lead demon opened its mouth wider and swallowed him in a rush. "Confirm last order, Giant," Olivia commanded in his ear. Andrash didn't respond. "Confirm last order, Giant," she repeated. When he still didn't respond, the Zonia gave him a love tap. The harmonic jab jarred the demon, who'd eagerly rushed into its human prey. Its spiritual assault wavered. Its malign intent shifted outward as it sensed something different in this human's uneven harmonic signature. Something angelic.
"What is this?"
asked the demon in a hollow voice, pulling back from Andrash as if tasting something nasty. His German accent told a story about his former life. In reply, Andrash flared. A brief, intense lighting of the entire visual spectrum, angelic flares dazzled and confused humans and angels alike. Elioud warriors normally flared instinctively to protect the innocent and overwhelm the enemy. In this instance, Andrash's flare ripped apart the lead demon's harmonic energy with the force of a white phosphorus grenade. It scattered the mass of demonia beyond the range of his angelic sonar. Although, of course, his nano-origami had also recorded and transmitted it back to the local Elioud Tactical Operations Center, or TOC.
"Giant, this is Dragonman. We registered a flare. What is your status?"
The hard voice of Mihail Castrioti, his commander and Olivia's husband, confirmed that in fact his little stunt had been immediately registered. Mihail's call sign, Dragonman, came from the fact that he was part dragon, or, in other words, part angel. That's because early humans all over the ancient world had identified seraphim, described as fiery winged serpents, as dragons, when these high-ranking angels had dominated history. In Albania, where Mihail was from, demi-angels were known as drangues, or dragon men. In Mihail's case, his father was also a drangue, and his mother an Irim, or watcher angel. That made him 3/4 angel and almost 600 years old. Basically, awe-inspiring in the terror-inducing sense of the word. Not that Andrash cared.
"Dragonman, this is Giant. The demonia have been dispatched and won't be bothering anyone in Prague for some time. Over." "Giant, would that be because you baited a demon and used my Zonia to free you?"
Mihail sounded angry.
"Against my express command." "Affirmative."
Andrash paused.
"What's the saying? Better to ask forgiveness than permission?" "What forgiveness? Permission was already denied."
Mihail began when Olivia interrupted. "Let's deal with this later, you two. Blackbird has arrived at Venceslas Square. He's confirmed that something is happening at a club called the Duplex. People are fleeing into the streets. Local authorities have received dozens of calls from people on site reporting a well-armed team in tactical gear searching the club." Andrash had already begun jogging east into the Old Town.
"ETA in 45 seconds.
His focus shifted to the new threat as if nothing else mattered. Because it didn't. "All right, Giant. Rendezvous with the team at the Mustek metro station, about 1/3 of a kilometer northwest of the club. Area 2 has sent building schematics and info on local law enforcement to our cell phones."
"Copy that,"
said Andrash as he sped his harmonics so that he disappeared from human sight. He ignored the turn toward Old Town Square where the Church of Our Lady Before Teen loomed like something out of a dark fairy tale. Even so, the twin Gothic towers that inspired the Disney castle were unmistakable against the dark night sky. If he let himself, he'd remember what Betta had said about the iconic church the night she found him in the Admiral Botel, farther south on the Vltava. Her words invaded his thoughts anyway. Those two. She tilted her chin towards the towers. Our ideal sniper nests. Position 2 shooters there, set a team at the bridge tower to block escape, herd all the tourists toward the square, and then... Here, she raised an imaginary sniper rifle and sighted down an invisible scope. Boom. She imitated the explosive sound of a sniper shot from a large-caliber gun. Of course, the sharp-tongued, prickly Czech would talk about weapons and ambush instead of the nicknames for the towers. Adam and Eve. Andras shook his head and ran faster. The Mustek metro station popped into view on his left as he halted. Dozens of panicked people dashed pell-mell along the sidewalks and clogged the broad streets of Venceslas Square. Andras scanned them, lips tight and hands fisted. All infrared signatures returned within normal ranges. No one had been shot, at least, but their harmonics rippled like leaves in a wild storm. Tires screeched, followed by the sounds of crunching plastic and glass. Horns blared. Someone screamed. Ahead, heavy discord roiled the harmonic plain in Venceslas Square, its locus centered on the distinctive glass dome of the nightclub. The timbre was all dark Irem. Asmodeus, if Andras had to bet, and the fallen Watcher Angel hadn't come alone. Miro appeared next to Andras. He looked grim.
Have you seen the schematics?
He asked.
Not yet. The main entrance on the ground functions as a funnel toward 2 elevators to the club. Very few patrons can exit at a time. There is a service entrance around the corner on Jindřiška Street, but not accessible to patrons. Most of them are still inside fighting their way out.
Yes, Miro said.
Or being trampled.
Olivia and Mihail appeared on the sidewalk next to them, their faces grim. Mihail's gaze touched each of theirs.
We need to bypass the front entrance to gain access to the club. Miro, you and Andras clear an entry point via the Marks and Spencer building next door. Olivia, you and I will take control of the main entrance. With luck, we will be able to get everyone out of the building faster with few casualties.
The Drongowe paused and threw a look over his shoulder. When he looked back again, his face had grown harder, if possible.
Enough planning. Shots have been fired. Time to move out.